I'm hoping that because we're here in New Mexico, which is a space very important to you both, and being in this place, the natural world feels especially close. We talked a bit, the three of us, before this talk, and we thought that maybe a topic we would begin with is a shared affinity that you both have, which was not in the list I just did, for horses.
We could talk the whole afternoon about that.
We could talk the whole afternoon. We promised we would.
We did at the Walker. That's all we talked about was horses the whole time.
But horses are a very powerful visual and metaphorical presence in the work that each of you has done through the years.
Double reins.
So I'd love to just talk a bit about how it all started for you both. Who wants to go first? Meredith, this is you. Maybe you should go first.
Well, I think that horses have always been a healing influence in my life. I started riding when I was 6 in camp, and I wish I could find this picture. Little teeny person, these teeny weeny little legs. I never rode a pony. I rode a full horse, but I'm sitting up straight, like smiling from ear to ear, like with these teeny little legs. And so I rode all the way through my childhood, and I just have always felt that it's something about the relationship. First of all, a horse does not need to have you on his back, his or her back, or its back, or their back. They're literally, you can't argue with a horse, let's put it that way. So I always feel like when I have a relationship with a horse, that I'm in touch with a much bigger power than me, and I'm just allowed to be part of that power. And when you have that relationship, it's just the most transcendent feeling. It's really heavenly. So this horse particularly, Felix, I never have owned a horse, and I haven't had the privilege to raise horses the way that Bruce has, but I've been allowed to be the rider of a horse. So Felix was kind of my horse, and he was just this. He's dead now, but he was a thoroughbred he had ridden on the track, but then he ended up, I think, even doing some cow pony work. And he was just one of these guys I would put anybody on him, but he had speed if you wanted it, like a real sensitive, wonderful, wonderful companion. And I just remember, going over jumps on him. And, I can't see 3 dimensions. And so going over a jump is really challenging. And there's something that you learn about riding a horse. In the jumping, for me, it's like if you anticipate a jump, then you fling your weight forward, and it's really hard on the horse. If you are afraid and they feel that, you're leaning back a little bit, then it's really hard on the horse's mouth. So it's this thing of being at one with the rhythm of a horse. So that has always been an amazing, amazing experience for me. And then I just remember galloping in the woods and seeing those beautiful golden ears in front of me, and it's hard to describe. It's just the most really ecstatic experience. So that's what I have to say.
And Bruce, you came to New Mexico in 1979,
Yes.
Is that right? And were horses part of the picture immediately, or how did that evolve for you?
My daughter was in school in Pecos, and friends of hers, a family that had been in Guerrero and had pack horses, and anyway, they found out I'd been a Boy Scout, and they said, "Can you build a fire when it's all wet and get the coffee going?" And I didn't know anything about horses, but they didn't care about that. If I could get the coffee made, that was my my introduction. And then I wanted to learn. I wanted to understand how horses worked and how young horses worked. So that's where my interest was. And I don't know, it's my daughter's fault, I guess. Or being a Boy Scout.
We wanted to show, before we launch into other questions, a moving image of the two of you. So maybe we'll jump into that and just be quiet for a moment and watch.
I can't believe that I did this.
She will start her course.
You're a much better rider than I am.
Oh, I knocked down the third rail, you'll see. Plonk.
Heard that.
Thank you, Meredith. Our next rider.
Oh, no, don't show anyone. Wow.
Oops.
On the forehead. Woo! Beautiful, man. So gorgeous.
Stop.
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 Stop. Yay. You turn on the forehand, turn on the haunches, right?
Well, yes.
You have to,
so-
it's like turn on the forehand when,
So this is a very young horse, well, probably 3-year-old.
right.
And if you give them these jobs, and it helps them to teaching them how to move the front end and the back end and back up and go
Right.
forward. And so you can go through a gate so many different ways, and they learn something, and you learn.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I kind of messed the horse up a little bit there by
Yeah.
getting off balance, but the horse didn't get upset, so that was important. Anyway,
I think
that's
something.
why I wanted to show this. It
Well,
was because you
something-
learn together.
I think something's really interesting about the way horses are being trained now. So, when we were young, there were breaking horses, and now it's a whole different idea that, we're learning from those animals. And, it's a co-learning. That's really what it is now.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of horses, maybe we zoom out a bit to the natural world more broadly. Meredith, your newest work, Indra's Net, is a work many years in the making, and it really does focus on this interconnectedness with the natural world. And can you speak a bit about how that came together and how you have connected the dots between the trilogy, the parts of the trilogy?
Well, first of all, I see an image of Atlas.
Yes.
So just to continue the horse theme a little further.
Oh, I did have two other
because
images.
the Walker actually was one of the people that made Atlas possible. It was a piece that we made for the Houston Grand Opera, and it was very interesting because I've always called them, for a number of pieces I've called them operas, but meaning much more a combination of elements. I think that's the potential that opera has. It's like perceptual modes is what I've always tried to work with, different perceptual modes. And I also, with traditional opera, I always hated the words, because I felt, well, the voice is saying something, and you have to keep reading, it's kind of, you're reading the libretto. So I was trying to break that down a little bit, the kind of conventions of opera. But around that time, I had not been riding for a little while, and I kept on dreaming about this black mare. And so that ended up being an image in the Opera Atlas. And the person that was the head of the Performing Arts Department, John Kalaki, when I arrived to work on it in Minneapolis, he came to the airport, took his shirt off, and he had a tattoo of that horse on his arm. He literally took his shirt off in the airport. So, so that theme has gone on. I just wanted to mention because the image was there.
I can't see what was behind me. I forgot we had one. That's right.
But about Indra's well, I feel like I feel like a lot of my work has been about our relationship to nature. I've always been very inspired by nature, and last night singing Songs from the Hill, I was really inspired by Placitas, New Mexico. My sister was living in the legendary Lower Farm commune, in the early 70s. And, I'll always be so grateful to her for introducing me to this beauty and magic, and that I'm allowed to be here a few months a year. And I've always been inspired by being here. So I wrote Songs from the Hill, sitting on a hill in Tawapa every day in the hot sun. I had been working with a voice and keyboard for a while, but I wanted to go back to the solo voice. So I just sat there until I got an inspiration just from sitting there. And then I made forms when I got back to the East Coast. But so I always feel that nature has been an inspiration, except for a few more urban pieces like Turtle Dreams or the games, pieces that are really working against that and trying to understand the culture, and our relationship to cities. With Indra's Net, it's the third part of a trilogy that starts with On Behalf of Nature. And that was inspired by, of course, thinking about ecology, and trying to see what could I do as an artist that, I don't work verbally. I'm not going to say, do pieces that say, don't throw your plastic bags away. I just don't work in that way. So how could I make a poetic form that, in a way, I think these pieces have more to do with a kind of elegy and a kind of sense that you leave the theater appreciating what we're in danger of losing. I think that that's really what the pieces have to do with. And On Behalf of Nature was inspired by the poet Gary Snyder. I saw an article, I'm a Buddhist practitioner, so in a Buddhist magazine I saw an article that he said that was called Writers and the War Against Nature. And he talked about how in ancient times, the shamanic tradition was really, it had two branches. One was telling the truth of what was going on, and one was representing entities that can't speak for themselves. But through music and dance.
That's all right.
Nature calls, as we're talking about nature. And so I just was, through music and dance, it just was so inspiring. So I started with that. And Katie Geisinger was in the audience, and I don't know if Allison's here, but, it was really a matter of how, I will always make pieces about nature. Am I going to make a piece on behalf of nature with tweet birds going across the stage? How do you do that, actually? And that's been part of, maybe the last 20 years of making pieces about subjects that you can't make pieces about, like impermanence, for example. So these, to me, it's contemplative kind of work. So we contemplate these different things when we're working, and then somehow that's part of the process of making the pieces. So that On Behalf of Nature was that. It was really a kind of sense of the motor or the processes of nature. Mm-hmm. And then Cellular Songs was the second one, and that was 5 women, and that was going even deeper, more into the fact that our bodies, the cell, and in the universe, a cell is the basic unit of nature, and within those very complex processes, they're interdependent, they're cooperative, and couldn't that be a metaphor for our society? So that was Cellular Songs, looking very deeply in. And then Indra's Net is going deeper in and deeper out, because the legend of Indra's Net comes from the Hindu-Buddhist tradition of teaching legends that kind of tell stories about principles in the universe. And the story is there was an enlightened king, Indra, who made a net that covered the whole universe. And at every intersection is a infinitely faceted jewel that reflects every other jewel. And the other thing about it that was really interesting, I always thought of them as being the same, but each jewel is unique, and yet it reflects every other jewel in the universe. So it just seemed like such a wonderful thing to work with, very spatial. And I worked on it for 10 years. And I worked on it even during the pandemic, like how to do it. And it felt like, we are in Indra's net now in this pandemic. We are all interdependent, but we're not aware of it. We are experiencing this in, an Earth event. So how do I make a piece that's a kind of antidote to the pain of it, and yet also includes that? So I hope I didn't talk too long, sorry.
No, that was great to hear about it. Thank you. And we did have one more image of a horse, which was Bruce's green horses. So you're back just in time. But I did want to talk more about animals in general. The horses. I mean, this piece is such a signature in your career, but animals have figured into your work for years in all kinds of ways. The deer, the wolf, the bear, the fox. Some are based on taxidermy. Some are fragments. Some are animals that skittle into the video in the studio. My favorite is Mapping the Studio, which is apparent. It's an empty space, we think, but it's very full.
Nice black cat.
And maybe you can tell us about how full it is and how that piece works.
Oh my. So I just wanted to find out what happened in the studio when I wasn't there. And so I set the camera up every night. And the only thing that I knew about that lived there was Princess the black cat, who had belonged to my daughter, and she moved and they wouldn't let her take the cat. So I got the cat. And the cat was very happy in the studio. And we were overrun by mice, and he was helping out with that. And so every morning I would go out and watch what had been recorded. And I took notes about, when a mouse appeared, didn't appear. Finally, the cat, there were so many mice, was really not interested in the whole program. But when I would run the thing on a big screen, the cat was totally interested. Cats like anything moving up there. But at the same time, there had just been published a new edition of Lewis and Clark's journals. And so there's 12 or 15, a lot. So after I would look at the night's doings and make notes, I would read some chapters or some days of Lewis's writings. He did most of the writing. And what was amazing was every day something happened to them. Sometimes it was just the number of mosquitoes. But it was like we were going on this journey together. It was an odd way of thinking about it, but that's how it felt to do that.
It's an incredible piece, and worth the duration of experiencing it, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would love to just step back into the 60s for a moment. I didn't want to start the talk at 68, but this was really such a formative time for both of you. And you were both, I think, intensely involved in your investigations of what art could be, forging new paths that were truly your own. I think each of you is striving to be unclassifiable and really helped pave the way for what is now called interdisciplinary art making, which at the time was not well understood, I think. That term did not exist. Bruce, you once noted of your early years that you had a realization, and I'll quote you, that if I was an artist and I was in the studio, then whatever I was doing in the studio must be art, which I think is very important to set the ground. You've both talked about your process in the 70s as one of unlearning traditional forms, and whereas Meredith has put it, working between the cracks of the disciplines, and really thinking about how various media can live alongside and with one another to complete the totality of a piece. So I know you first met in 1968, the two of you. You bonded, from what I've learned, through an appreciation of everyday simple actions. And soon thereafter, Meredith, you were performing in a piece of Bruce's, and I know he performed in a piece of yours. And maybe the two of you can talk about that moment, those two moments, 1968.
Well, you were at Santa Barbara.
Well, I think that was that first, or was the Falling Against the Wall first? I couldn't remember.
I think Santa Barbara was first.
Okay, so we had met through Robert Morris, who was a good friend of both of us, and I think you were still in school, Bruce, at that time. But somehow you knew about my work, and I never understood how that happened.
I don't either.
Okay.
But you were working at something in San Francisco.
Yes, I was.
That's how I happened to.
Yeah, and
with
so.
Bob
And then what
got in
happened?
the same room with you.
Right, exactly. Or you came to dinner or something like that, because I was living in that house.
Yeah.
I was renting a room in that huge house.
Okay.
So anyway, what happened was that there was an art festival in Santa Barbara, and I don't think I'd even met Richard Serra, but we were sitting on the airplane together just laughing so hard because Richard is this big, brawny guy. And do you remember, like in the old days when you got food, the silver was really teeny? And so I remember I was just cracking up with him eating with this little fork. And so we really had a good time. And then there was Bruce. So the three of us hung out together, sort of like the Three Stooges. And then I had to do a performance, and I had just finished Juice at the Guggenheim, where I was literally painted head to toe red, everything, like red hair, red body, red behind the ears, and everything is hard to get off, red clothing. And for some reason, I don't know how this happened, I just decided, well, it would be really interesting if I just do my continuity, which was more vocal and movement orientation of the material, mostly from Juice, and then Bruce asked Bruce and Richard to be on stage with me. So these were the tasks that these two guys did. So I was the continuity, doing my vocal a cappella things and movement, and then Bruce decided he was going to line himself up on the edge of the stage. His whole body took a long time to line himself up, and then he'd fall off the stage, and then he'd get back up and line himself back up again. And then Richard's tasks, he had two different tasks. So one task was, and he was like in his undershirt, like, I said it was like being with a bear and a fox. So Richard could any time during my performance just come and lift me up and put me someplace else. So that was one of his tasks. And then the other one was that he would get himself dizzy backstage and then kind of lumber on in the middle on the stage. And we just had I just remember having such a wonderful time with the two of you. We laughed a lot. I remember you and I talking a lot about music.
Yes.
I knew that you were really a music person.
Yeah.
And we just, and then we did,
Falling off the stage was very good because there was an orchestra pit down there. And the audience couldn't see down there. So when I rolled off, I just
You disappear. What is the name of your piece? Disappearing.
Disappearing acts.
Disappearing.
Yes.
He already did that. So then I think a year later, I get this telephone call from Bruce saying, "Will you be in this piece at the Whitney?" And I said, "Of course." The piece was that the three of us, his first wife, and I borrowed her sunglasses so that I had these silver sunglasses. We were in the three corners of this gallery and basically fell against the wall for an hour. So it was like, in different rhythms. And I tried to be very musical about it. I tried to be really musical about it. And I remember thinking at that time, because it was, there was the minimalism was sort of the going thing. And I never could squeeze my head into that. I just couldn't do it, I just admired it so much. It was just such an amazing, it was a beautiful piece. It was an absolutely beautiful piece.
The three rhythms were.
The three rhythms. And then I remember Marcia Tucker coming and saying, "Are you all right? You look kind of pale." And I said, "I am pale. I'm fine." I just remember with a great pleasure that it was a wonderful thing to perform. Yeah.
Yeah, we enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Even though it was hard.
It didn't hurt, though.
No.
And also, a task-oriented performing was at that time was something that a lot of people were thinking about, and it's such a refreshing thing actually because it takes you out of you're basically doing a task, and it's very refreshing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very refreshing.
Reading John Cage, and he talks about that a lot. I don't think I only saw him perform once or maybe twice, so it was his writing that was important to me. And I saw Merce maybe once or twice, and I was just amazed as he got older that he knew what he could still do and be really present. It was pretty
I
important.
knew John
for
at
that.
the last part of his life. Again, I didn't, I knew him more from his readings, but
Yeah.
at the end of his life, we became very good friends. He was wonderful to be with. We would just laugh and laugh and laugh. And he loved my singing. And I actually sang I sang a piece of his while he was still alive called Aria, which was really hard because in a way, it's like these charts, and in a way, you have to compose the piece yourself. I felt that I could have used 2 years to work on it. And it's actually also very linear, so it's not organic at all. My music is much more circular, I would say. So it's... but then, in 2012, I performed his pieces along with Jesse Norman and Joan LaBarbera called the John Cage Songbooks. Yuval Sharon was the director. They asked me, and I usually don't perform other people's pieces. But I did love John very much, and so I said, okay. It was so hard. I mean, I had to also compose a piece of my own during this festival, and I'd be in this music school working on my own piece. I'd be like, walking out the door. I'd be working on John Cage's pieces, and I'd be faint when I walked out the door. And they'd say, I guess you're working on the John Cage. So here's the thing with John Cage is that everybody thinks it's just this free-for-all and improvisation and everything. It is not. His thing is that you have to be so devoted to his instructions. You literally have to completely immerse yourself in trying to understand his instructions. And I remember one of them was sing as written. So it was not improvisation. It was a song about Marcel Duchamp. And it was only, the melody was only 5 notes, but the rhythms, I mean, I'd be in tears. I had my friend Nuri Tillis trying to count it out. I was trying to get every single rest, and I'm trying to sing it as written, and I'm in tears, and I'm saying, you're imprisoning me, John. I'm in prison wherever you are. And so then when I got onto the stage, when I got out to San Francisco, Michael Tilson Thomas was the conductor, and he said, Meredith, why don't you do it more conversationally? I'm like, oh my God. And then I realized if I hadn't done all that work, I wouldn't even know what he was talking about. I would have just been lost. And then in the performance, it was so profound. I felt like he created these limitations so that you found your way through. That was the thing. And again, it was a task-oriented thing where there were clocks on the stage. You had this series of things that you had to do. If you missed the seconds, if you didn't look at the clock and you were wrong, your next song had to be a little shorter. So you were kind of, very alert, fulfilling this thing. And then I realized that I had complete freedom, actually, within that limitation because I put that work in. It was amazing. You're a wonderful spirit, John Cage. And also, he came to my house. He brought a bag of mushrooms, which I cooked up. They were very gamey. I made rice for him, and we just laughed and laughed. That was basically my relationship with him.
At one time, I think it was the Anthony DeFay Gallery. Juliet will remember better than I will. But they were doing some sort of installation of John Cage drawings or notes or something, and they asked me if I would contribute something. And so I either faxed or telegraphed Fat Chance John Cage. And they said, no, we want you to do something. I tried to, no, that's what I did.
Didn't you also do a set, like a kind of decor thing for Merce?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
Fans, right?
Fans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they blew
Well,
out.
they blew out. I had them blowing on the dancers, and boy, they didn't like that. They were all going to be dead of pneumonia, and so and fans around. Yeah.
So did
But it was, because Jasper Johns had been doing the sets for Merce, and then he would ask other people to do them. So I was in New York, and Jasper said, "Come over and meet Merce, and we'll discuss or whatever you want to do." So I went over, and being a Midwestern and Western fellow, I'd already had lunch at noon. And Jasper and his friend were still eating chicken at 2:00 in the afternoon. So, "Do you want some lunch?" No, but he had some Maker's Mark, and he kept my glass full. And Merce was late, and when he finally came in, I tried to stand up to say hello, and my knees just went right out from it, and my chin hit the table, and nobody noticed. So Merce and I had our discussion, but that was the only time
that you worked?
yeah.
Yeah.
He didn't care what I did. He just wanted to say hello.
The images are amazing. The installation was incredible of that piece. So speaking of Cage, I mean, how did your knowledge of his work and his influence affect each of your perception of duration or time in the way that you build your works? I mean, has that been a factor you think about as you're
Yes, but there were other influences. I knew Steve Reich and Terry Riley and Lamont Young, all kinds of things about time and extending time, and even Andy Warhol.
films?
The films that were 24 hours or whatever, and then when I realized that he cheated on him, that was even better. And. But the idea that things were just going on and you can walk into it at any time and experience whatever part of it and leave and then come back and it was still there, it was still going. Yeah. I mean, that was Lamont's idea that the music was always there. And that was, I was trying very hard to get away from the academic way of thinking of being an artist, and I wanted the things that I was interested in going to the mountains and music, and I wanted all of it to be in the work. So it's hard work.
It is
to get it all in the work.
How has duration been something you've worked with?
Well, I think
Meredith?
in a different way, and I also want to just say something about Bruce in my life is that, working in between the cracks of forms, sometimes it was really, really challenging. I think there was kind of a misunderstanding that one is a dilettante, particularly in the performing arts, not so much in the visual arts, because a person can paint, they can draw, they can, do, it's more accepted, like Leonardo da Vinci. But just knowing that Bruce was alive on the planet and there was another person, who was, found the form for their idea, found the form, tried to find the right form for their idea, gave me a lot of courage. I don't know if you ever know that, but I just want to say that. You and John Cocteau, so, but anyway, with the duration, so I was trying to break down the performance experience, the habitual behavior. You go to something, you sit there, you go and have coffee and say whether you liked it or not, and that's it, and go home. So my idea was more, could I make work that went over a certain period of time? For example, I think it's easier for me to just tell you about Juice. So the first part was in the Guggenheim Museum, and it had about 100 people in it, and the audience did have different times where they moved. So at that time, I was also very interested in the audience being the movers and the performers being still, and reversing the relationship, and also distances. So the first part at the Guggenheim, the audience was on the floor looking up, And I could do disappearance acts with those the ramps because
The rotunda,
in the rotunda, because you just see people over the edge and then they would just go away, and I could work with that. And so it was a very large and choral kind of piece, very very ephemeral and extended. And then the second part, the audience walked up the ramps, and there were simultaneous events going on in the little alcoves, so you could, again, take your choice to see what was there or move to the next place. And then the third part of it, the audience was on the ramps looking down, and I had 100 people playing Jews harps and doing this dance, so you're seeing it from overhead, so it kind of turned the building inside out. And then a month later, so that was like the large work. And then a month later, the audience went to a little proscenium stage at Barnard College, and I wanted to emphasize the frame of what a stage usually is, actually call attention to that. So I had branches coming out from the edges. It was like sort of a giant puppet show, and there were only 9 people in that. And I had, in the Guggenheim, 4 of us were painted red, and we were traversing from the bottom to the top. There was a process of us going from the bottom to the top, while there was a chorus of 80 people going over waves over the rotunda, the balconies. What do you call it?
In the theater.
I'm talking about in the Guggenheim.
Oh,
the
ramps.
ramp. Yeah. So in that little theater, it was 9 of us. So it was becoming a kind of close up, and so what I was trying for was to also have memory and scale be part of the experience. So you saw the red people as one little element in this big Guggenheim piece. I had someone on a horse riding up and down Fifth Avenue, before you went into the Guggenheim. And then before you went into the Minor Latham Playhouse, I had a child on a rocking horse. And then you became closer and closer to these 4 people. And then the third part was a month later in my loft, but it was a gallery show of the 100 Jews harps, the 100 red combat boots, all the red costumes, all the objects, and you could smell them and touch them, but there were no people. And then there was a close-up video of all of these 4 people's faces, almost like the television set was their heads. So, I was really trying to break this idea down, and also could memory also be part of your present experience?
I'm struck by when you're talking about Jews, because I know that the props and the objects were quite simple in that. I mean, I've held those boots in my hand. Yeah, and you both are using this kind of simple object that then takes us to other places. And I was thinking about the table in your exhibition, and maybe you could tell us a bit about that object. That simple, straightforward, seemingly straightforward object that is really quite dense and complicated.
It was a post office desk, and I have no idea when or where we acquired it, but it's been around for quite a while. But it's beautiful wood, it's quarter sawn maple or oak, I'm not sure which. I've never cleaned it. It came with that beautiful,
It's beautiful.
Smooth, shiny finish. And then all those deep gouges and scratches that some postal worker took out on the table. But it's so when we first thought about how to do the piece, I was going to put a piece of white or gray cardboard down, and then that just seemed so stupid with that table, so beautiful. And the first time we shot just a couple of test shots, and you could see how it was just.
It's such
so
it's like a beautiful
beautiful.
painting or
Yeah,
abstraction.
yeah. To not use it was pointless. But yeah, and it's still it's Michelle's desk, and she works at it, and we had to clear it off to work on it, but that was okay. Yeah.
I'm thinking of other simple but now iconic objects. Your white T-shirt, for example, in all of the videos, which has now been shown again in the recent piece.
No, it's a different one.
It's a different white T-shirt. But maybe you
because
both,
we couldn't. The old one was getting pretty worn out, and it had a certain weight and flow, and the material was so beautiful, and so the way the way it draped was so. And when we went to try and find a new one to replace it, it was really hard. Really had to look a lot.
Hard.
Yeah, to get something that would approximate that kind of.
Like beautiful
Presence.
simplicity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I think, Meredith, that's something you've also thought about too when you're thinking about the visual complements to the voice, to the group of performers. Keep it simple. Let the objects carry additional weight. Are there some objects that you can think of that really had that kind of, or you really had to explore to find the right thing?
Well, actually, I was there. The piece that comes to mind is another large work that took place in three different site-specific places over a period of a week. And that was it's called Vessel, and it was loosely based on Joan of Arc as a kind of visionary character, but in a very contemporary way, a female visionary person. But in that piece, I was really working with very simple objects, but sort of using them as a language. So, for example, so I would take an object like a rake, like a garden rake, and in part one, it was a little child and a man, and they had silver paper bags over their heads, and they became the soldiers, and they had a battle with those rakes. And then in part two, the king had the rake as a scepter. I mean, it's sort of like working with objects as vocabulary or something like that, and how do you, and in kind of a musical way. It was actually really working with them in a musical way. So, so that was one idea. And again, scale. There was a character threw coins on the ground in part one. Part two, we made giant coins. It was just this thing of working with scale, and also, I would say as time has gone by, it's more like, I think what I'm interested in, and I think Bruce is too, is having it be that you see things that you take for granted in a new way. So that when you leave a performance, you might look at something that you've never seen before in the way that you see it after you've seen it looking at an artwork, so that we appreciate that everything is sacred, in our world, the simplest things.
Well, maybe before Bruce returns, we can talk about the simplicity of words and language. I mean, in your work in particular, words are very sparing. I mean, I was actually surprised last night to hear more words than I remembered in some of your songs.
Yes.
But maybe you can talk a bit about the use of language to build something, to build a piece, to think about words that then become abstract. I know many of the sounds that you're using do build into something that starts as almost a recognizable word and then it goes away or becomes its own kind of mantra. But maybe I want to ask Bruce the same question because he uses words in a much different way.
Well, I think
very
when I do
specific
use
and
words,
pointed.
I think when I have used words, I don't really like to use words as narrative, because then that's a medium that's imposed on experience. So I think what I'm trying for is to give an audience the direct experience that transcends the part of our minds that's always narrating our experience and that's labeling our experience. It's like the numinous. I'm trying for the numinous, but I think that. So if I do use words like Last Night, Happy Woman, or Between Song, I always use them as lists, kind of like litanies, so that it has a more abstract kind of quality. But I think at the very beginning of my exploration of the voice, I come from a singer's family. I'm the fourth generation, and so I started working with my voice. I had a revelation that the voice could be like an instrument, and that because I come from music and dance background, movement as well, I trust the nonverbal. And so when I started working with my voice, I realized the voice itself is a language. And yet I feel that in some of the early pieces, it was right at the edge of language was implied. And that reminds me of a piece of Bruce's that I saw in Italy. My work, I'm thinking of a piece that was on my first album, Key, that's called What Does It Mean? And you hear or even Understreet, the first piece, you kind of almost hear the words, but you don't quite hear the words. Or Dolman music, the beginning of that, where it's like men having a kind of conclave and conversation, but it would be as if you're either hearing it from far away or you don't understand the language, but you know they're conversing. Or even, when I'm working with Katie and Allison, we're working with musical notes, but we're speaking. We're really speaking, and that's part of, I think, something that has always meant a lot to me.
We were just talking about how the words could be building blocks. In Meredith's case, they also start to become abstraction in a way. And I think your use of words is similar in that you're choosing them very carefully, but they then can build into something that is abstract or larger than the word itself. Can you talk about how you choose words?
Well, I had a very strong interest in language, coming out of reading Wittgenstein, and excuse me,
Wittgenstein.
yeah, and then finding those phrases and just presenting them. The first studio I had in San Francisco was a small grocery store, and it still had the beer sign in the window. And so that idea of one way, if you're on the outside, it reads Schlitz or Blatz, whatever. Inside, it's reversed. And so I started thinking about that, the flipping and flopping of words and images, and inside and outside. And so I never, so even though I wrote those things, and I wrote some things that were maybe poems, but they were out of such anguish.
Yeah.
So that wasn't something, I wasn't going to be a writer,
Yeah.
I'm glad that didn't happen again.
I love what you said about the backwards words. I mean, I'm thinking about your prints. Pay attention, motherfuckers, or raw war, or those the lithograph itself or the it's
Right.
reversed.
I always enjoyed the printmaking because you never know quite what's going to happen because it does reverse. Mm-hmm. And
Chance. Yeah.
yeah. That when I first worked at, this is for Sydney,
Sydney's
Gemini,
here.
and Serge was the head printer, and I did that print called "Pay Attention, Motherfuckers," and he, being French, kept saying, "This is completely pay attention, motherfucker." And I'm inclined to still go back to Gemini and do the print that way.
That would be amazing. Well, I know we're getting short on time, so I want to ask you one more question, and then maybe we'll open it up for a few from the audience. And I do have a couple more images if we're able to put them up for this particular question. But I did want to ask you both, because of the work that's in the exhibition, Self-Portrait at 80, just to think about self-portraiture for a minute. It has been in your work, both of you, since the very beginning. And what we're looking at here are two really early pieces done at exactly the same time. Meredith Monk's 16 millimeter earrings and Bruce's art makeup. And this is an example, I think, in these two where you're both masking in a way, or it's a bit of a self-portrait, but it's also about creating a character. But then your image has moved through the work in so many different ways. And I think now, as we look at the work being made right now, it's there in another way. But maybe you two could talk about this idea of letting your own body be the image in some of these first works.
Well, coming from a movement and voice background, music background, I never really thought about particularly, just my body was my instrument, so I don't think I was so aware until 16 millimeter earrings, where I really did use the body as a subject matter, because I had this Wilhelm Reich text during a little gestural section that I did, and it was very much working with, really, this was my big breakthrough piece where I was able to combine perceptual modes into one form. And I was thinking in a very painterly way. I had 4 different kinds of projection. One was my face, this image over my head. Again, working with scale that you can't do in live performance that easily. I think one of the things that I loved about working with the portraiture was it's something that you can't do on stage. You really have to do it with film or video to make the scale and to get that kind of close-up aspect. And so that was really the beginning of that for me. Yeah.
And this was very early. Was this one of the first works you did with color? Or I know you were working in black and white at the beginning.
Yeah, because there are a lot of experimental filmmakers in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. And it was very easy to borrow 16 millimeter cameras and use out-of-date film, and it was all black and white. Mm-hmm. And so I just used that. And I had done, the small amount of performing, but I wasn't comfortable being a performer. But putting it on film was okay.
Except in Meredith's piece, of course.
Yes.
Right.
And
Yeah.
falling off yes.
Pulling off. But doing the films and later the videotapes was a way that I could perform, but not really be in the public eye. And so assigning myself these tasks, and then part of what interested me in these repetitive tasks was you get tired, and then the tension changes, and to learn how to use that as part of the presentation or the performance.
When you watch them, you see your body start to slow down
Yeah.
or to get tired
Trip
from
and
the
fall.
action, trip and fall. That's absolutely true as a spectator too.
Yeah.
Maybe we can show the next slide quickly. This is a poke in the eye, and then Bloodline Shrine. I just wanted to show some earlier or some more middle career pieces here. And this is a piece where you're slowing the video down
Yep.
tremendously,
Yep.
so that we're really paying attention to every crevice and hair and
Yeah.
movement. In your piece, Meredith, the faces are static. I mean, they're moving, but they're very.
Sometimes they're completely still, so you just see them as land. I think of the face as landscape, and I've
the same
used
with
a
yours
lot of
too, I
landscape and a lot of faces in my work. And so sometimes you hear us singing. We're singing a kind of canonic thing, and actually the images start rotating in that one face. It goes. It moves over one. But then there's sometimes where you'll see just our mouths singing. You literally see our mouths singing, or you'll see an eye, or you'll see like a little, very much like this is interesting, Bruce. Like you'll just see an ear, and it's kind of like, it's like the Martian's view of what a weird looking thing we are as human beings, or somebody's, one little like beauty mark on somebody's cheek or something. I mean, it's so interesting, like to work with it.
Well, I was just, how much can you slow it down and have it have any recognition or speed it up? Slowing down was more interesting to me. Yeah.
And finally, I wanted to show the image from the exhibition alongside a recent work of Meredith's, which is part of Indra's Net. It's a video installation that's meant to accompany your piece. I'm really struck by these two portraits, and they're very recent. They're both of you within the last 2 years.
Double chins and all. Yuck.
And I just love
My God.
the fact that you're still
I did that.
Very
My
focused
sequence
on-
very short. Did you notice? So everybody's gets a whole rotation. Mine gets a half a rotation.
You're the director. It's your film. So I would love to hear you talk about this impulse to revisit work in your case with this piece, and this idea of continuing to use your image visually now.
Well, actually, this was shot in it was a year earlier, so it's a lie. I was only 79, yeah. And I was working with Bruce and Susanna Hamilton and making this 3D, which we'd done with commercial Hollywood folks before, and we thought we could do it ourselves. And we nearly called them up and said, "Come back." Well, we did it. We got it done. But just the tension of trying to walk a straight line was the main thing. The other thing is, initially I was holding a sculptor's hammer and a sculptor's chisel
In the first version.
in my hands,
Oh.
and well, when we were working on it, and they weighed like a couple of pounds each, and you sure can't hold your arms out like that very long. So I got rid of the tools.
Well, we'd love to open it up for a few questions before we need to wrap it up.
Thank you for the talk today. It's been great, and it was a privilege to see the performance last night. Very powerful. I'm interested in what I might call the materiality of the image and seeing the work in terms of the 3D coming into the viewer space, and even the way in Bruce, your work, that the sound fills the space and light fills the space. And I was struck in the recent exhibition catalog for the Contrapposto Studies in Venice, where one of the articles even mentioned the weight of the image or the heaviness of the image. And I'm wondering if you could comment on, or whether you think you directly make a comment on sculpture with the 2D image, so that I guess the 2D image and filling the space of the viewer and kind of becoming sculpture or commenting on sculpture.
I worked in at some point, I was saying earlier, it was easier for me to perform give myself a task in front of a camera rather than in a public situation. And I did that a lot, but I was still making sculptural objects. And then more over the last few years, it's been almost all video. And so I kind of considered this last piece, the self-portrait, I'm done with that. No more 3D video, no more video. And I've started making things again and drawing. And it's such a relief. Because I started making things. I wanted to make things, That's where I am now. It's very important.
Hello, thank you. I was inspired that this began with horses and your mutual affinity for horses, and it made me realize that so many of our experiences in life and expressions as artists are somewhat autobiographical as they're born. And to see your mutual love for horses and your individual relationships made me realize that we sort of go through life, we make it up as we go, but when you hit these inspired moments, you put so much energy into creating these high concept pieces, and they're They're so moving, and your rapport is so inspiring. I would like to invite you, as 80-year-old elders, to imagine yourselves as 23-year-olds moving into the future. What would you hand me, a 58-year-old, middle of the road, right on the end of, I guess, my midlife? You know, I'm heading into the next. What would you offer us as the inspiration as a young person moving into the world? Thank you.
You mean what did inspire us, or what? Because we're not young people moving into the world right now. We're moving out of the world. but do you mean like what I saw at that time?
To imagine yourselves as in 1968, but you're in 2023 now. To put yourself in the 21st century as a young person.
Yeah. Well, I think that there was a certain point that I felt that my personal. Well, I think this thing of integrating these different forms was really urgent for my. It was urgent psychologically and psychically for me as a human being to somehow not be fragmented. I mean, that I think I would have faltered if I hadn't found my artwork. And I think that there was a certain point where I felt that that thing of integrating our senses and our thoughts and our hearts and, you know, our bodies and integrating all these different centers was something that seemed really necessary in our world, because our world is very fragmented, and it still is, and that somehow this was a way of offering like an alternative to this kind of fragmentation that we live with all the time, and that in fact only Western European culture separates these art forms. You know, that basically there's so many other cultures, African culture, Asian culture, that these forms are integrated. And that making art is a kind of spiritual practice. And so I think that I intuited that already as a very young artist, that there was a social aspect to this as well as the personal, trying to find my wholeness as a human being. So I would say that that hasn't changed that much, and that what I've learned, I think, in my life, first of all, I feel so blessed that I've been able to somehow, even with the struggles and everything as part of this narrative, I've been able to follow my own path, and that path has not been done before. And, you know, it's funny, like I was in Japan talking to a tea master, a young tea master, and he said, well, that's prescribed, like that's a path that you take as a tea master, that's your discipline. And I said, you know, I don't actually really have that. I've got to take each step myself and try to figure out what it is. And sometimes that's quite challenging, but I think that what I've learned is that, you know, if you find the thing that you love to do in this lifetime, that is going to hold you in good stead for the rest of your life, and that will take you into the next part of your life. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. Well, I because I was living on the West Coast, and there was always this sense of competition with the East Coast, and especially in San Francisco. Los Angeles was looser. But I also had the feeling that I wanted to make work so good, nobody could find it.
The disappearing act returns.
I have a closing question, because I know we do have to wrap up. Can each of you say one thing about the other's work that has inspired you?
As I said before, I think Bruce's adventurousness and desire to find his own way of doing things has given me a lot of inspiration and courage over the years.
And just knowing you, that's all it took. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all.